Have you ever felt like you were drowning in plain sight, surrounded by people, laughter, light, yet inside it's nothing but shadows? It's as if you're trapped in a room with no windows, no doors, and the worst part, no one else can see it. They look at you, expecting you to smile, to move on, to be okay. And you try. But every step feels like wading through invisible mud, every breath like a battle against a weight pressing down on your chest. This is what millions live with every single day. We call it depression, but truthfully, we barely understand what it really is. Most people think depression is just sadness, a bad day, a storm you can simply wait out. They'll say things like, cheer up, count your blessings. Others have it worse. And while these words might be well-meaning, they cut deeper than silence. Because depression isn't just sadness, it's a silent erosion of the soul. A relentless fog that blurs your sense of purpose, your sense of self, your very will to exist. And perhaps what makes it so dangerous is how invisible it is. You can fake a smile, go to work, post on social media, and no one would ever guess the battles being fought within you. In the modern world, we label it a mental illness, a chemical imbalance, a product of stress, trauma, or genetics. And while science isn't wrong, perhaps it isn't entirely right either. What if depression is more than a malfunction of the brain? What if it's the voice of the soul calling out for something it's been denied for too long? For over 2,500 years, Buddhist wisdom has spoken of suffering, not as an anomaly, not as a personal failing, but as an inescapable part of existence. The Buddha never promised a life free from pain. He simply offered a path to understand it, to confront it, and ultimately to transcend it. What if depression is suffering misunderstood, a modern name for an ancient human experience? And what if, through the lens of Buddhism, we could learn not just to manage it, but to transform it? In this journey we're about to take together, we won't speak of depression as something to be ashamed of, or something to get over. We'll explore it for what it truly is, a message, a signal from the deepest corners of the heart and mind, a message that somewhere along the way we lost touch with something essential, a message that perhaps we've been searching for happiness in all the wrong places. This isn't a sermon, it isn't a lecture, it's a conversation between you and yourself, between the part of you that feels broken and the part of you that has quietly, patiently, always remained whole. As we begin, imagine standing in the center of a vast, ancient forest. The trees stretch endlessly in every direction. The light barely filters through the thick canopy. And yet, somewhere out there, beyond the darkness, is a clearing. A place of stillness, of clarity, of peace. This is not about avoiding the shadows. It's about learning to walk through them. Because depression isn't weakness. It isn't failure, it's human. And in the ancient teachings of the Buddha, there lies a profound understanding of this invisible darkness and how to find the dawn beyond it. Now, let's begin. Have you ever wondered why life hurts the way it does? Why some wounds fade and others, the ones no one else can see, linger for years, sometimes a lifetime? In Buddhism, suffering isn't an accident. It isn't punishment. And it isn't something wrong with you. It's part of being human. When the Buddha spoke of suffering, he called it dukkha. But dukkha isn't just pain. It's the unsatisfactoriness of life itself, the way things fall apart, the way happiness slips through our fingers, the way what we cling to eventually leaves. And at the heart of depression lies this exact truth, a quiet grief for what was lost, what was never had, or what can't be controlled. So what causes this suffering? In the Buddha's first teaching after enlightenment, the Four Noble Truths, he didn't just acknowledge suffering, he dissected it, laid it bare. He taught that at the root of our suffering are three poisons: craving, aversion, and delusion. Let's look at them. First, craving. The endless hunger for things to be different, for more money, more love, more recognition, or sometimes for the pain to simply stop. But here's the cruel twist. The more we crave, the deeper the emptiness when it isn't fulfilled. Depression often begins here in unmet longing, for connection, for meaning, for peace. And when the world doesn't deliver, a quiet despair takes root. Then comes aversion, the desperate urge to push away what we fear, what hurts, or what we don't want to face. We bury old traumas, avoid difficult conversations, numb ourselves with distractions. But the mind is like water. You can stir the surface, but the sediment will always settle back in. And every unhealed wound becomes a weight on the heart, a heaviness that over time feels like depression. And finally, delusion. The most subtle and perhaps most dangerous. It's the false belief that life is supposed to be perfect, that happiness is constant, that we are separate, isolated selves alone in our struggles. Modern culture feeds this delusion. Endless images of curated joy. 1,000 voices telling us what we should be, how we should look, what we should achieve. And when our inner world doesn't match this fantasy, shame creeps in. We start believing something's wrong with us, that we're broken. But Buddhism teaches otherwise. It says, this is the nature of life. It rises and falls, joy and sorrow, gain and loss, praise and blame, like waves on the ocean. The problem isn't the suffering itself. It's our resistance to it. When we fight the darkness, it tightens its grip. When we numb it, it grows louder in the silence. But when we turn toward it with gentle awareness, something begins to shift. So what causes depression through the lens of Buddhism? It's not weakness, not fate, not punishment. It's the natural outcome of a mind caught in craving, aversion, and delusion in a world that constantly changes. And here's the truth. You don't need to fix yourself. You were never broken. The Buddha never promised a life without pain. He promised a way to understand it, to see its roots. And when you see the roots, you no longer have to be tangled by them. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how Buddhist practice doesn't deny depression, but gently holds it in compassionate awareness. We'll uncover ancient tools, meditation, mindfulness, loving kindness, not as quick fixes, but as lanterns to light the path through the darkest nights. Because the darkness isn't the end, it's the beginning of understanding. Let's keep walking. There's a battle happening inside you, a quiet war no one else can see, not between good and evil, but between peace and turmoil, between the voice that says you are enough, and the one that whispers, you'll never be okay. We often think of depression as a heavy sadness, a dark mood, but at its core it's a storm of thoughts, relentless, insistent, and cruelly convincing. Buddhism has a name for this phenomenon. It calls it papanka, the tendency of the mind to proliferate thoughts. Like ripples from a stone dropped in water, one thought leads to another, then another, until you're drowning in a sea of your own making. It starts small. A missed opportunity, a harsh word someone said years ago, a moment of loneliness, and before you know it, the mind seizes it, twists it, adds layers of meaning. I failed. I'm always failing. I'll never succeed. There's something wrong with me. And so it spirals. This is the trap of negative thinking. It feeds itself. It convinces you that you are your thoughts, that because your mind whispers, I am worthless, it must be true. But here's the liberating truth Buddhism reveals. You are not your thoughts. The Buddha taught that thoughts are like clouds. They arise, they pass. They are not solid, they are not who you are. Yet when we cling to them, when we believe every fearful or self-critical thought, suffering takes hold. The mind becomes like a room with no windows, every thought bouncing off the walls. No light, no space, just echoes of your worst fears. And what makes these negative thoughts so powerful is their familiarity. We replay the same narratives for years. I'm not enough. No one truly cares. I'll never be happy. They become grooves in the mind, like tracks worn deep in a forest path. The more we walk them, the easier it becomes to fall into them. Buddhism calls this habit energy, the unconscious patterns that drive our emotions and actions. When left unexamined, habit energy imprisons us. It turns our own mind into a battlefield. But awareness is the way out. The Buddha often spoke of mindfulness, sati, as the key to liberation. Not to stop thoughts, but to see them clearly. To notice when the mind says, "I can't do this," and gently reply, "That's a thought, not a fact." Every time you recognize a negative thought as just a thought, not reality, you weaken its hold. It's like shining a small lantern in a dark room. The shadows lose their power. This practice isn't easy. The battle within is subtle, persistent, but it's not unwinnable. Buddhism invites us to watch the mind like a compassionate observer, not with harsh judgment, not with the demand to think positive, but with a quiet curiosity. Sadness is here. Fear has appeared. The thought of being worthless has arisen. And when you see the thought, it no longer owns you. Over time, this awareness creates space. And in that space, a new kind of freedom is born. Because here's what's most radical about the Buddhist view. You don't need to eliminate negative thoughts to find peace. You simply need to stop believing them. Thoughts will come and go, like clouds in the sky, like waves on the shore, but the sky remains. And you, the awareness beneath the storm, remain. Depression feeds on unquestioned thoughts. But mindfulness is the antidote. It won't erase pain overnight, but it offers a path through it. One clear breath, one observed thought, one gentle moment at a time. And though the battle within may rage, you are not powerless. You are not broken. You are the one who sees. And in seeing, you begin to heal. In the next chapter, we'll explore the ancient tools the Buddha offered to calm the restless mind and ease the ache of the heart. Because even in the darkest night, there are practices that light the way. And you too can walk this path. In a world that constantly demands movement. More noise, more distraction, more doing. The greatest act of courage may simply be to stop, to sit, to be still, and to listen. For centuries, Buddhist masters have taught that stillness is not an absence of life, but its deepest expression. That within the quiet, we meet ourselves as we truly are, not as our thoughts insist we must be. And for a mind consumed by depression, this stillness can feel terrifying at first. Because when you slow down, there's no distraction left. The ache inside comes to the surface. The restless thoughts, the buried grief, the gnawing sense of unworthiness. But it's precisely here, in this vulnerable place, that healing begins. The Buddha discovered this over 2,500 years ago. After years of seeking outside himself, through asceticism, ritual, and philosophy, he finally turned inward. He sat beneath the Bodhi tree and vowed not to rise until he understood the nature of suffering. And what did he find? Not a mystical revelation, not an escape from pain, but a clear seeing. A profound realization that suffering is born from the mind's attachments, aversions, and illusions. And that by observing the mind without clinging, without running, one could be free. This is the power of meditation. Not to escape your depression, but to sit with it, to know it, to gently untangle its roots. Modern neuroscience now confirms what Buddhist monks have known for centuries, that regular meditation literally reshapes the brain. Studies reveal it calms the overactive amygdala, the brain's fear center. It strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the seat of awareness and emotional regulation. It reduces rumination, the endless mental loops that fuel depression. But beyond the science lies something more intimate. A space where, for the first time, you might hear the ache inside, without being devoured by it. When you meditate, you're not trying to stop thoughts. That's a common misconception. The mind thinks that's what it does. Meditation teaches you to notice those thoughts, to let them come and go, like leaves floating down a stream. At first, you'll be swept away by them, a memory of regret, a surge of hopelessness, a harsh inner critic. But each time you gently return to your breath, to the sensation of sitting, to the simplicity of this moment, you weaken the thought's hold, and you begin to glimpse a profound truth. You are not your depression. You are the space in which it arises. The Buddha taught a practice called anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. Simple, accessible, and quietly revolutionary. By placing attention on the natural flow of the breath, you anchor yourself in the present. Not the regrets of the past, not the fears of the future, but right here, right now. And in this small, unassuming act, the storm begins to settle. Buddhist teachers often describe the mind as a muddy glass of water. If you keep stirring it, it remains cloudy. But if you set it down, the sediment slowly settles, and the water becomes clear. Meditation is setting the glass down. It doesn't mean life's problems disappear, but your relationship to them changes. The racing thoughts, the old wounds, the self-loathing voices, they may still visit, but you see them for what they are, transient, empty, not the ultimate truth. And sometimes in the quiet you'll notice something else, a tenderness beneath the pain, a flicker of warmth, a sense of being held not by anything external, but by the vast, open awareness that is your true nature. This is what meditation offers the depressed mind. Not a quick fix, not a numbing escape, but a path of remembering that beneath the storm of thoughts and emotions, there's a stillness that has never been broken, a light that was never extinguished, and no matter how long you felt lost, it patiently waits for you to return, one breath at a time, one moment of awareness, one quiet, courageous act of sitting still. In the next chapter, we'll explore ancient Buddhist techniques for transforming destructive thought patterns, and how even the darkest mind can be gradually illuminated through wisdom and compassion. Because you are not alone in this struggle, and the path has always been here, waiting. If depression is a storm that darkens the mind, then compassion is the gentle warmth that melts the ice within the heart. For centuries, Buddhist masters have understood a truth that modern science is only beginning to confirm, that healing is not only an inner battle of thoughts, but a profound restoration of the heart. In the teachings of the Buddha, there is a practice known as metta bhavana, the cultivation of loving kindness. At first glance, it seems simple. You sit quietly. You focus on the wish for yourself and others to be well, to be happy, to be free from suffering. But beneath its simplicity lies a profound medicine for the wounded mind. Because depression does not only isolate us from others, it turns us against ourselves. It wraps the heart in layers of shame, guilt, and loneliness. It makes us believe we are unworthy of love, that we have somehow failed at being human. And in this tangled darkness, even the thought of offering kindness to ourselves feels impossible. The Buddha taught that true healing begins with compassion, karuna, not as pity, not as self-indulgence, but as a fierce, tender awareness of suffering coupled with the sincere wish to relieve it. And the first step is to turn this compassion inward. In meditation, you might begin by repeating a simple phrase: "May I be well, may I be peaceful, may I be free from suffering." At first, these words might feel hollow. You might resist them. Your mind might whisper, "I don't deserve this." But as you persist, something begins to soften. Because beneath the harsh judgments of the mind, there is a part of you silent, enduring, that longs to be held with tenderness. In Buddhist philosophy, every being, no matter how lost, no matter how broken, possesses Buddha nature, an innate potential for wisdom, love, and awakening. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to prove yourself worthy of it. It has always been yours. And metta meditation is a way to remember. You start with yourself, then gradually extend it outward. May my loved ones be well. May strangers be well. May those who have hurt me be well. May all beings everywhere be peaceful and free. This practice isn't meant to deny the reality of your pain. It isn't spiritual bypassing. It's not about plastering positivity over despair. It's about expanding the heart so that it's vast enough to hold both joy and sorrow, so that you are no longer crushed by your own suffering, but can meet it with steady, open hands. Neuroscience has now confirmed that loving-kindness meditation reshapes the brain's emotional centers. It increases feelings of connection, reduces self-criticism, and even lowers physical markers of stress and inflammation. But its deepest gift is subtler. It reminds us that we are not separate, that our pain is not a private prison, that countless others, right now in this very moment, are also battling despair, loneliness, and fear. And in recognizing this shared humanity, a strange thing happens. The walls of isolation begin to crack, and light slips in. The Buddha often used the image of a mother's love for her only child, a fierce, unconditional care, and he encouraged his followers to extend this kind of boundless compassion to all beings, including themselves. In depression, the hardest thing is often to feel worthy of love. But in Buddhism, you don't have to be perfect to deserve compassion. You don't have to be healed to be held. You only have to be willing to turn toward your own suffering, with the tenderness you might offer a wounded friend. And slowly, compassion becomes a habit, a refuge, a way of being. You begin to see that your depression is not a personal failure, but part of the universal human experience, that within your pain there is wisdom, and within your brokenness, a doorway to deeper understanding. The ancient masters taught that when the heart is cultivated in this way, even the darkest nights can reveal hidden stars. And no matter how long you've been lost, there is a way back, a way paved not by self-loathing, but by loving kindness, not by harsh judgment, but by tender awareness, because the heart, even a hurting one, was made for this. In our next chapter, we'll explore how Buddhist wisdom views impermanence, and how understanding that nothing lasts forever can become a powerful light in the darkest hours, because even the deepest sorrow is destined to change, and even the longest night gives way to dawn. For centuries, those who suffered the invisible wounds of the mind had little refuge but silence. They endured in isolation, whispering their pain only to the night. But today, something remarkable is happening. Two ancient rivers, one from the east, one from the west, are beginning to meet. The wisdom of Buddhist philosophy and the science of modern psychology are finding common ground, and in that meeting, new pathways of healing are being born. At the heart of Buddhism lies the middle way, the path between extremes, neither indulging in every craving, nor denying life's pleasures entirely, neither drowning in suffering, nor pretending it doesn't exist. The Buddha discovered this after years of self-mortification, when he realized that neither luxury nor deprivation led to liberation. And in the same way, healing the mind requires a middle path, one that honors both spiritual wisdom and clinical science. Modern therapy has brought extraordinary gifts. It has given us language for what we feel. It has mapped the shadows of the mind. It has taught us that depression is not weakness, but a condition, one that can be understood, treated, and eased. And Buddhism offers something complementary, a way to sit with suffering without being consumed by it, a method to observe thoughts as passing clouds, to notice emotions as waves upon a vast, unchanging sea. Together, these two approaches do not contradict one another. They complete one another. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, teach us how to identify and challenge distorted thinking patterns, the very traps we spoke of earlier. They show us how to interrupt cycles of hopelessness and self-criticism. Meanwhile, Buddhist mindfulness practices cultivate the ability to witness thoughts without attachment, to see a thought arise, "I am worthless," and instead of clinging to it, to silently acknowledge, "This is a thought, it will pass." When combined, therapy offers the tools, and Buddhism offers the space. In recent years, a movement called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, has blended these approaches. Clinical studies have shown that MBCT can significantly reduce the risk of depressive relapse. Patients are taught not only to challenge harmful beliefs, but also to accept the presence of difficult emotions without panic. This is the middle way in action, not fighting every sorrow, and not surrendering to despair, but walking a steady path between. One of the greatest misunderstandings about Buddhism is that it teaches people to suppress or deny emotions. But true Buddhist practice isn't about being numb. It's about cultivating equanimity, a steady mind that remains open to both joy and sorrow, without clinging to either. Modern therapy, for all its strengths, can sometimes become overly focused on control, on eliminating discomfort. But Buddhism gently reminds us, suffering is inevitable. What matters is how we relate to it. And so, when these two ways of healing are combined, They offer both strength and softness, the skill to reshape thought patterns, and the wisdom to embrace life as it is. For those battling depression, this integration is profound. It means you can sit with a therapist and explore your story. You can learn to challenge harmful narratives, and in the quiet of your room, you can also light a candle, sit in stillness, and breathe through the storms of your mind. You are no longer choosing between science and spirit. You are walking a path where both walk beside you. The Buddha once said, "As a goldsmith tests gold by burning, cutting, and rubbing it, so should you examine my words and accept them not merely out of reverence, but after testing them for yourself." And in the same way, you are invited to test these tools, not to accept them blindly, but to see what brings you peace, to find your own middle way. In the end, healing is not about perfection, not about erasing every shadow. It's about becoming so spacious within that your sadness no longer defines you, that you can hold both joy and sorrow in the vast, quiet heart of your being. And when modern therapy and ancient wisdom walk together, they can lead you there, to a place beyond labels, beyond symptoms, to your true self. In our final chapter, we'll reflect on what it means to truly live with depression, not as a burden to be ashamed of, but as a profound teacher, because sometimes it's in the darkest valleys that the deepest wisdom is born, and there is always a path forward, even if for now you can't see it. And so, we've come to the end of this path together, from the silent ache of depression's shadow, through the tangled roots of suffering, into the battlefields of the mind, and onward to the quiet refuge of stillness. We've met the ancient wisdom of Buddhism and watched as it wove itself into the threads of modern science, a reminder that no matter how vast the darkness may seem, dawn is never far away. If there's one truth the Buddha shared above all, it's this: all conditioned things are impermanent, this too shall pass. No feeling, no sorrow, no thought, however heavy, is eternal. It rises, it falls, and like the waves upon the shore, it recedes, and in those fleeting gaps between, there's a quiet place within you that has never been broken, a space untouched by sorrow, unscarred by despair. It waits patiently. It is your true nature. The journey of healing is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you've always been, beneath the noise of pain. It's about walking back home to yourself. And if depression is a darkness, then Buddhist wisdom reminds us, even the deepest night cannot hold back the dawn. In this series, we didn't claim to have easy answers, because real healing isn't quick, it isn't tidy, and it isn't linear. It's a winding road, with moments of both ache and beauty. But if you've made it this far, something within you refuses to give up, and that is worth honoring. If this message spoke to you, if you found even a moment of peace, a spark of recognition, or a glimpse of hope within these words, we invite you to walk further with us. On this channel, we explore not just Buddhist wisdom, but the universal truths that bind us all. Stories of suffering, healing, presence, and awakening. So if this journey resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications, so you won't miss the next path we'll walk together. And if you know someone carrying an invisible weight of their own, share this with them. You never know whose life you might touch. With a little light, as we part ways for now, remember, even in your darkest moments, you are not alone. Somewhere a candle is burning for you. And one day, whether tomorrow, next month, or next year, you will find your dawn. Until then, may you be well, may you be at peace, and may you remember the light you carry within.